Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book-to-screen adaptation. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today I am breaking down Outlander Season 8, Episode 1, titled Soul of a Rebel. And I wanted to do a long-form podcast just because I have lots of commentary on the episode. It's easier for me to really fully flesh out my thoughts in a podcast form. So hopefully you guys enjoy. As always, if you are looking to avoid spoilers from the books or the TV show, please be warned that we will be discussing both in depth. The title of this episode is the name of Frank Randall's book that Bree brings back from the future in order to show Jamie. And we open this episode with Claire and Jamie trying to sell whiskey to a buyer in a boathouse in Savannah. And Jamie is under the alias Mr. Roy. He is speaking to a man named Vasquez and reveals that he got his name from Mrs. Abbott in Philadelphia. And Mrs. Abbott is the woman who runs the brothel that Jane and Fanny are from. The captain, the pirate, had come back to Philly with two girls whom he found at sea, and we get the reveal from him that while on board the ship that was under the command of a Captain Pocock, he discovered that he had brought his wife and two daughters with him, and he owed a debt, so he ended up killing the captain and taking Jane and Fanny because he knew they would be worth a lot to the brothel owner. And he described the captain's wife as a rabid dog. And as soon as he went to take Jane and Fanny, she went ballistic, and so he threw her overboard. The whole time this is happening, we can see that Claire is trying to keep her composure and is struggling. And Jamie had asked her earlier on in the scene to be quiet. So we know that there's something going on here. And if you didn't read the book, you might be a little confused as to what's happening. But in the book, the story is similar. Jane and Fanny's parents were on a ship heading to America with their two daughters and their dog. And when they finally arrived in America, Jane and Fanny's parents were dead, even though it's never confirmed exactly how. But one theory that comes up in the book is that a pirate had killed their parents, just like the show is choosing to take that route, and the captain of the ship sold the girls to the brothel to pay his debt. In the book, Ian actually goes to the brothel to try and find more information about Jane and Fanny, so a lot of the information that he gets in the book is secondhand information from the women in the brothel. So none of it's ever actually verified, and Ian is also told that when Jane and Fanny were sold to the brothel, Jane was supposed to still have had her maidenhead, but then it was later discovered that that was untrue. So the show decided to make it canon that the pirate had taken it, but again, in the book, that's not confirmed. And clearly, they are trying to truncate storylines, and having Ian go to the brothel and do all of that legwork and make him travel there would just take way too much time, and we have him back at the Ridge, and so they instead have this scene play out on screen. As we're listening to the horrible things that this captain is saying, Claire then decides to take matters into her own hands, and she stabs him to death, which I was so deeply confused by because Claire, for 8 seasons now, has sworn oath to never cross that line, and it felt so out of character for her and the opposite of what I would expect from this scene, especially so early on in the season. It just made me think that she was so unstable, and then to have the rest of the episode carry on like she would not be carrying that weight of having done that for the remainder of the episode. It just felt so out of character because we've seen Claire go through some horrific things herself, and she still wasn't able to cross that line, but then she crosses it immediately here. It just felt like a not very well written scene in terms of us as viewers understanding her motivations. Also, for her and Jamie to operate so strongly under the assumption that Faith lived is so strange, because they still can't even verify that Faith lived. So for her to kill a man anyways is odd. This never happens in the books. And for the show to insinuate that Faith lived in this time, then was thrown overboard on a ship for protecting her daughters, and then having her daughters be sold into a brothel, and then hearing that this is what happens to her daughters, only for Claire and Jamie to magically cross paths with them in this twist of fate, and then learn that about their daughter. It just seems incredibly unnecessary and cruel for what I feel is very little payoff. It also just feels like such a reach for me, and I have never loved this storyline. It does feel like a cheap one, and it's not canon to the books. This will never ever happen in the books, so it does feel like an unnecessary departure that the show included, and I just am never going to get behind it. I don't think, even if they change it or have more twists and turns, I just don't think I'm going to enjoy it. It feels like time wasted on a storyline that does not matter in the long game. Then we get a conversation between Jamie and Claire where he has this beautiful line of, "I'm the true home of your heart." And they discuss how, despite Claire losing her own parents so young, she and Jamie found one another and found love in each other. And so they can take comfort knowing that Faith would have been loved as well, despite not knowing that Claire and Jamie lived and would have done anything to have raised her. And again, this is meant to be a very tender moment between them, but I can't invest in it because they still can't verify that what they're upset over is even the truth. So it just feels cheap to me, for lack of a better word. Then we get the title card of the episode where we see hands typing on a typewriter, which are meant to be Frank's, who is writing the book. And they do something new here, which is that they put the credits into the title card clip on the piece of paper and then also on a book. So that's kind of a new device that's been introduced here. We get a date, a timestamp, and a location, Savannah, 1779. We don't know what month. And Jamie has already been awake. He says he hasn't slept because he was thinking about Faith. They wish that they could give themselves more answers through Fanny, but they both don't want to push her on it. And in the book, Fanny does have very little memories about her parents, and so Claire kind of pieces things together about them through Fanny and what she can recall, but it's, again, very fragmented. And she went through a lot of trauma, so a lot of it is stuff that Claire doesn't want to dig too deeply into, so not to incite more trauma on her. But again, it's so strange to me that they're both so dead set on Fanny being their granddaughter. And I just don't understand how we got here. It doesn't feel like these very rational characters would allow themselves to buy into something like this so easily. The scene breaks when Jamie hears giggling outside his door. And when he opens the door, he finds all his grandkids at the door with Marcelly and Fergus. So now we know that they are staying with them at their print shop in Savannah. And this is a storyline from the books where Fergus opens up a printing company where he prints the local newspaper. And he notes to Jamie later on that they had just arrived here before the British took over the city. And so Fergus is choosing to keep his newspaper neutral, so not to draw attention to himself since he is French. He actually is even complimentary of the British in the newspaper and is trying to use the tools and advice that he had learned from Jamie when Jamie was working in his own print shop. Many of the British army that had seized the city were also Highlanders, and so Fergus notes that that was helpful, that his last name is Fraser, and that he's also married to Marcelly, who is Scottish. The scene with Claire and Jamie and the grandkids, when Jamie is in the print shop, he goes looking for a hidden compartment similar to one that he would have had in his print shop, and he finds seditious papers that Fergus has hidden in the walls, and he warns Fergus about them because he has a family, and we have seen just how big his family is. We got our eyes on all the children. Fergus, who I absolutely love, I'm thrilled to have him and Marcelly back on screen. They make such a big difference in the show. He tells Jamie, "I learned how to do this from you," and he basically calls Jamie out for that. And he has this beautiful line, "My pen is my sword." But Jamie wants Fergus to be careful and he promises that he will always. And so I loved that even though this was a short, quick scene, we have now confirmation that Fergus and Marcelly are in Savannah. They've opened a print shop. They're all doing well. And so I know that this storyline for the two of them is going to be very heartbreaking. So I'm reveling in the fact that the scene that we do have with them is so sweet, because I really do love Marcelly and Fergus. The scene with Claire and Jamie and the grandkids actually steals dialogue from a scene that happens later on in the episode where Mandy and Jem have arrived at the Ridge and are eating cookies before Mandy asks the family to read her a book. And here the line that they borrow is about counting legs and dividing by 4. They use it amongst Fergus and Marcelly's family instead. And so when we are back at the table with all of those kids ready to eat, we see Fanny with them as well. She's eager to help with all these kids. Once the kids leave, Fergus and everyone at the table start to talk about Fanny, and he starts asking questions about her childhood in a brothel because he can relate to that. And he points out that she has lost her home and her sister, and that would be something that's very difficult for her at her age to wrap her mind around, and she's alone. So they tell Fergus and Marcelly that they're going to bring her with them back to the Ridge and leave Savannah. And so we leave Fergus and Marcelly there, and Fanny and Claire and Jamie start to head back to Fraser's Ridge. Now again, a lot of this is heightened by the fact that we as viewers know that Jamie and Claire are so convinced that Fanny is their granddaughter. So there's a lot of that kind of going into the acting choices here. Claire looks at her very affectionately in every scene that they're in. In the book, I think the relationship dynamic between Claire and Fanny is also very friendly and motherly, but I think the show's playing it in a very different angle than the book, and Fanny is being played in a very different way than in the book too. She's someone who's very candid in the book. She has a tongue tie, so she has a lisp in the book, and she blurts out what comes across as very inappropriate statements informed by her time in a brothel throughout the story, and Claire has to kindly teach her that you can't talk like that in front of people, but we don't seem to get that. She seems to be far less mouthy and candid in the show version. When they're riding in the carriage together, Fanny is shocked that Fraser's Ridge is so vast and so large, and Jamie and Claire make a point to tell her that this is her home now as well. And we cut then to Lord John and William, and I feel like this is where the show starts to get really choppy for me, because the splices in this make no sense. We are with them in the woods driving to Fraser's Ridge. We cut to Lord John and William. They have a very short scene, and then we cut back to the Ridge and then cut again to John and William. I would have liked them to just finish the scene in Fraser's Ridge, then go to John and William, have that play out in its entirety, and then move on. So I don't really understand the choices made for how they spliced this. But in our first scene with Lord John and William, there's a baby, and John is holding this baby, and William has been taken to his house by a British soldier because he had been drunk, and they're worried that he might have been, coercing with the enemy. And that's when we're introduced to Trevor, who is William's cousin Ben's son. So it does look like we're going to be getting the Ben storyline, although again, I assume it's going to be truncated. Then again, we cut back to the Ridge. Claire is with Fanny. They're at the location of the house that had burned down, and Ian comes to see them, and he runs over to them very excitedly and reintroduces himself to Fanny and tells Claire that the baby hasn't come yet, so they all will head together to see what Ian has been doing in their absence before we splice back to John and William. And William admits that he is in the city looking for Captain Richardson, but none of the rebels would speak to him or give him any information unless he got them drunk. So that's why we see him very intoxicated and hungover in this scene. But in the book, William shows up to Lord John's home with another character named John Cinnamon, who I believe they have cut from the show. and he meets Amaranthus for the first time in John's house, but it's under very different circumstances and in a very different timeline. He had already been searching for Ben by the time he meets Amaranthus in the book. At this point in the show, he does not know that Ben had gone missing and is presumed dead. So in the show, John confirms William's cousin Ben has a wife and a baby, but tells William that Ben is not here and is reported as dead. And William is deeply hurt by this. And John says that Ben was taken prisoner, held at Middlebrook encampment in New Jersey, and then succumbed to an outbreak of jail fever. And when William asks for more information, John tries to comfort him, despite the fact that he doesn't have any more information beyond that. And both Henry and Hal are mentioned by John, and he says that neither of them know about Ben yet because he doesn't know how to tell his brother that his eldest son has died. In the book, that's when William offers to go and search for Ben because he does not believe that he could be dead. And in September of 1778, William finds Ben's grave, but the body buried inside of it is not Ben's. And so he goes searching for Amaranthus in January of 1779 after he gets a tip from Claire. And while looking for her, he doesn't find her, but instead finds Fanny. And Fanny tells William that Jane has been taken and arrested. And so you can see here that the timeline has been changed quite a lot in the show because Jane has already died by this point in the story. Amaranthus and Trevor are revealed to have appeared on John's doorstep, with Amaranthus claiming she was Ben's widow and she had fallen into a difficult circumstance because of Ben's death. And William starts to question things because he believes Ben would have told him if he had been married, or at the very least told his brother. And so William thinks someone in their family would have known if he had actually been married to this woman. In the book, John and his niece Dottie actually go looking for Amaranthus and Trevor in Savannah. So that's another change from the book. And John and his brother Hal are the ones who ultimately end up finding her. In the show, she had come to John with love letters with Ben's signet ring, and Trevor bears the name Wattiswade, which is a family name. And William thinks that John's being a fool, and that's when Amaranthus appears and calls William a drunkard and a fool himself and leaves very abruptly. And I thought it was kind of interesting that she just leaves because I was thinking to myself, did you leave without your baby? Back on the ridge, we see the new big house, which in the show is already built. That's a change from the story. When Claire and Jamie get back to the ridge in the book, the big house is not built yet. It had been cleared for land and everything, but it was not built like it is in the show. It does look close to the description in the books, and Ian shows them what he built with the other men on the ridge, saying that people of the ridge all joined together to put the house together by donating furniture, and that he had already staked out a garden for Claire. So all of this is a show change, and we get to see Rachel for the first time, who is very visibly pregnant. And Ian, Jamie, Claire, and Rachel go into the house together. We hear Jamie thank Ian and Gallic, and the inside of the house is so much more rustic than the one previous to this. We can see that it's still incomplete. And so I expect over the course of the season that the house will change quite a bit as they start to put the finishing touches on it. Claire walks into her new surgery, so we can see beds and instruments because everything would have had to be replaced since she lost so much in the fire. And this is when Hiram Crombie is mentioned. I'll go into a deeper dive on him later on in the episode. Claire promises that she'll take good care of Rachel and the baby since they're going to be the first patients. And Jamie brings Fanny upstairs to show her her very own room, which is still framed and the walls are not completed. And Fanny can't believe that she would be getting an entire room for herself. And since they're adding the layer of Jamie believing she could be one of his grandkids, that adds to the intensity of this scene. In the book, like I said, Fanny also is tongue-tied with a lisp, and so since they removed that from the show, we don't get the scene in the book where Claire performs surgery once they're back on the ridge. And over the course of the story, they help Fanny to improve her speech, and she's also a character that serves kind of as comedic relief with how abrupt her commentary is. So I'll be curious if over the course of the season they introduce any of that, because it seems like she's a very different character in the show. That night, we see Claire looking out the window, and Jamie comes in, and it's a very similarly composed shot to season 1 when they are in Lallybroch together, and it sets the tone for the scene before the dialogue even starts, because it's a visual callback that show watchers will immediately recognize. The camera angle is the same, the distance is the same, the physicality is the same. But in the book, this plays out very differently, because Roger and Bree and the kids are already there. They're staying in the very first cabin that was built on Fraser's Ridge because the big house has not been finished yet. And the conversation in the book starts off a bit more tense because Claire is concerned about why Bree and Roger have returned, and she knows that the reason must be bad. And her and Jamie are both terrified, knowing that they are not safer in this time than they would be in the future. So for them to come back means that they're running from something quite terrible. Jamie and Claire then leave the house and continue their conversation outside by a fire, which is where this dialogue is pulled from. In the show, Jamie and Claire are in the big house, and Jamie tells her that he is convinced he knows that the night Faith was conceived is when they were at Lallybroch. And in the book, they're looking at the stars outside, laying outside by the fire, and he recalls not seeing stars like this since the night they conceived Faith. The show instead does the same camera blocking and angles and choreography to draw the parallel to a different moment from season 1 instead of the Abbey. He thinks that the night they conceived Faith was in the Abbey in France after he is rescued from the prison. And so the dialogue here is much the same as the book, but in the book, he's recalling that he had been near death in that abbey after they escaped. And so the weight of his words is very different here, because in the show, Jamie is reminding us and Claire that it was the night she first told Jamie she loved him that he conceived Faith with her. And we get dialogue callbacks of what he said to her back then. So the entire scene is definitely meant to be a strong visual and narrative callback moment, and he says he knew he was giving her a child. We cut back to the people of the Ridge who are all meeting at Crombie's trading post, and Jamie and Claire look incredibly happy to be back there. And we see Amy McCallum, her boys. She confirms that she has now married someone else, and her last name is Lindsay. So she's married Evan Lindsay. And this is the same character we saw Roger with while she was in mourning. But in the book, her name is Amy Higgins, and she's married to a man named Bobby Higgins, who I think the show has completely omitted. Bobby was originally hired by Lord John Grey to be a servant, and he had been sent by John to the Ridge back in 1773. The first time they went, John brings him to have his eye inspected by Claire. He ended up losing it after a fight in a tavern. The next time he comes to the Ridge, it's to bring letters from John, and he shows interest in both Lizzie and Malva, but both women are not interested in him and they reject his marriage proposal. And then he ends up coming back to the Ridge for good in 1776, and that's when Roger actually introduces him to Amy McCallum, and they get married, and they live in the house that Jamie and Claire built first on the Ridge, which is where Bree and Roger used to live. So by the time we're in 1779, which is the current timeline, Bobby would have been in the role that we see Ian in, where he had cleared the land for the big house, helps build it. He'd been serving as a factor on the Ridge, and he had ushered in multiple families while Jamie and Claire were gone, and is very close to Jamie and the Fraser family. Unfortunately for this character, and the show having introduced her, they can either lean into this or omit it and just mention her as a character. In the book, later on after everyone returns to the Ridge, Amy, Bree, Jemmy, Mandy, and Amy's sons are out hunting, and Amy is very tragically killed by a bear. And Bree manages to get her back to the Ridge, but she ends up passing away there with her husband and her sons. And it's a really, really sad, tragic scene. And I think this is going to be a callback to the trailer, because we got a shot of Jamie building a coffin, And I think a lot of people assumed it might be for Henri Christian, but it could be for Amy as well. We see Hiram Crombie appear, and he welcomes them back, shows them inside of his trading post where he sells fabrics and tools and medical supplies. He is a character who is largely representative of the fisher folk on the ridge, and in the book he has a brother, Cyrus, who ends up showing interest in Fanny down the road, so it'll be interesting to see if we get him. Hiram is also largely intertwined with Captain Cunningham and a side plot that Cunningham gets up to on the ridge, but ultimately he is a character who is loyal to Jamie. We do meet Charles Cunningham for the first time in this scene, and he announces himself as Crombie's partner for the trading post. And the actor who plays him, Kieran Bew, is also in the show House of the Dragon. You might recognize him from that show if you watch House of the Dragon. Charles Cunningham has been living on the ridge with his mother, and he moved here while Jamie and Claire were away. And so Jamie accompanies him out of Hiram's trading post to start asking him more questions and get to know this man a little bit more. And Jamie clarifies to Charles that he is no longer associated with the Continental Army and therefore does not maintain his title. This dialogue mainly felt like filler to remind the viewer of what happened at the end of season 7. And then Jamie presses to find out more information about Cunningham's title as captain. Cunningham says he prefers captain because he never liked the name Charles, but also admits that he served for the king for 30 years as a British captain who fought against Jamie as both an American and as a Scot. He tells Jamie he laid down his sword after the Battle of Bemis Heights and points out that he knows Jamie was at Saratoga. And so Jamie acknowledges that they were very recently enemies, and Cunningham says he is most happy to be done with war. The Battle of Bemis Heights is the one that took place in October of 1777, where we saw General Simon Fraser, just for reference. Jamie asks him how he finds himself at Fraser's Ridge, and Cunningham tells Jamie that he had acquaintances, he came to visit them, and then he walked until his legs could carry him no further, and that brought him to Fraser's Ridge in the spot on top of a hill that we see in the show. On their way back to the house, Jamie and Claire start talking about Cunningham and how things have changed so much at the Ridge in their absence, and Jamie is suspicious about Cunningham, which rightfully so, but Claire points out that people can wonder the same things about Jamie, as in, is he ever truly done with war and serving? Many people would argue that Jamie can say that he is all he wants, but I don't know how many people can believe that fully, including Jamie himself. We cut back to William and John, and we see John giving William an egg to help with his hangover. And John says he's set to dine with General Prevost in an hour and asks William to go with him. And that's a character that's mentioned quite often in the book. He is a commander of the British company from Florida who joins forces with Colonel Campbell to take Savannah in the book. And both Hal and John meet with him a handful of times throughout the story. He had a nickname Old Bullet Head because he had been hit by a bullet and his skull fractured during the Battle of Quebec. William can largely see through John's attempts to get William back into the army, and John tries to remind William that the British Army is not to blame for Jane's death, but William very deeply feels that it is his fault. And both he and John want revenge on Captain Richardson, but John reminds him that they can be more calculated with their efforts because William, like his biological father, can be quite hot-headed. If William is truly done with the army, John thinks he should perhaps return home to England and take up his role as the Earl. And William struggles in his own head with this quite a lot through the last two books 8 and 9. He does not feel worthy of his title. Despite those details, he owns the title, and he doesn't know if he even wants it, especially now that he knows that his parentage is so false. And John has a great quote that's pulled from the book and reworked slightly, that a peerage is the gift of a grateful monarch. There are no means set down in law to renounce it. A monarch who ceases to be grateful can strip a man of his title, though the only grounds for that which come to mind are to engage in rebellion against the crown. And in the book, Hal Gray is actually present during this conversation, and he warns William that if he's willing to resort to treason and betrayal of his country, king, and family as a way to deal with his issues, then John had not raised him very well. In the show, we see William sort of smiling sarcastically when they talk about treason, and he feels unsure of who he is. And John says if it is up to him to decide who he wishes to be, so be it. But regardless of the name or title he claims, no man with any claim to his parentage would speak to a lady the way he did Amaranthus, and so he insists that William make it right with her, which we do see later on in the episode. Back on the ridge, we see the bee's nest that Lizzie brings to Claire, along with her daughter, who is named Claire. But in the book, John Quincy Myers is actually the one who brings Claire a swarm of bees, and he's the one who tells Claire about how to talk to them, and he blesses them. But they give a lot of those talking points to Jamie here, actually. And so they set the hive quite close to the house. In the books, it feels like they're closer to the woods over by Claire's garden. And Jamie tells Claire about the lore and the bees and why you have to talk to them, about what's going on with the ridge and the people who reside there. And so that's a theme that is woven into the book quite heavily. So I expect that we're going to get a lot more scenes of Claire actually talking to the bees. That's when the camera angle changes and we get this fuzzy image of a doll in a little girl's hand, and we see Roger and Bree and the kids approaching the ridge. And Claire looks like she's seen a ghost and she might fall over, and Bree runs to hug her, and they're reunited again, and once again the wigs are terrible. The Hello the House scene in the book takes place right at the end of Written in My Own Heart's Blood, and then this scene is quite shorter. It drags out a lot longer in the book than it does in the show. And we see in the show Claire and Jamie meet a grown Mandy, and we hear Bree tell her parents that they simply wanted to come home. In the book, Claire knows there is far more to the story than that, none of which can be good. And I think the show version is less impactful than the books, because in the book, Claire sees them approaching from a great distance and can hardly believe her eyes as the family walks across a field, and she keeps thinking to herself that they look so much like Bree and Roger and the kids. And it's not until they hear Hello the House from a distance that they realize that it's actually them. Once they're inside, Bree asks Jamie about Fanny and how she came to be with them, and Jamie mentions that it was by way of William, and Bree learns that William now knows Jamie as his dad, and therefore that she is his sister. And Bree tells Jamie to give him some time to come around to it. So Bree and William's stories intertwine with one another in the book, so this is more foreshadowing that we're going to get to see the two of them interacting in this season. This is when Mandy asks Jamie to read her a book, and how we're going to get a segue onto the topic of Frank's book, which is a huge part of season 8. And Jamie opens Mandy's book and is shocked by the way it looks. And Fanny is also shocked by the way it looks. But for them to openly look through this picture book and not be at all concerned about Fanny, who in the book is like such a blabbermouth, it seems weird to me. But again, they've changed her in the show. She doesn't seem to be as candid about things, so I guess they're not worried about her talking about it in front of other people. In the book, Germain is actually with Jamie and Claire as well, but in the show he stays with Fergus and Marcelly. So again, this is a slightly recycled scene from the book that plays out differently on screen. The other change is that the story Jamie reads in the book is a Dr. Seuss one. In the show, they have a callback to season 3, and Claire tells Jamie that this is the story she told him while they were on the ship. She used to read to Brianna as a kid. Bree looks like Santa Claus pulling books from her bag, and she gifts Claire the Merc Manual 13th edition. And a lot of the dialogue that Jamie delivers in that scene is straight from the book as well. For Jamie, she brought Frodo Baggins and Lord of the Rings, and in the book, they give Jamie books 1 and 2, and he thinks it would be nice to read them with Fanny, because Fanny was taught how to read by Jane, and that would be something that the two of them could do together and bond over. Jamie and Roger are talking later, and Jamie asks him if he was a minister in the future, and he says no. Jamie then reassures him that there's new folk here that have settled here, and he should make a point to go make his introductions. And he tells Roger about Cunningham, and that he wants Roger to help him get a better read on him. And that's when Claire and Bree come back, sit at the dining table, and say that the kids have been put to bed, and they talk about the letters that Claire and Jamie had left them at a bank in Edinburgh, and how Claire and Jamie didn't know if they would work. They largely leave that entire storyline out of the show and truncate it a lot. It's actually really fascinating how they explain away the letters in the book. It's too much for me to include here in a formal breakdown. Maybe I'll do a separate video about that or talk about that separately, but they definitely truncated that. And that moment is when Bree decides to present the Soul of a Rebel, Scottish Roots of the American Revolution book by Frank to Claire. It was published after she and Claire left, and she tells Jamie that she's never read it, which to me is wild. And she says she knew that if she had read it, it would feel like she lost her father all over again. But to me, I'm not buying that. To me, I think if you're holding a book that your father wrote about the very thing you're about to walk back into, which is the American Revolution, I would want to read that. I would, especially when the dedication page is for her. That I have a hard time buying into. Roger and Bree also say that they had spaced out reading the letters because it felt like it suspended the belief of them still being alive, which also happens in the book. Bree and Roger also come closer to admitting why they came back in this scene, and Claire says they need to know about Fanny and Bree's sister Faith. And once again, I really just dislike this storyline. We don't even get this conversation on screen, which to me felt like an odd choice. So we as viewers don't actually know what Claire and Jamie have decided to tell Bree and Roger about this Faith storyline either. So it just felt like an odd, clunky choice to insert here and bring it back up again. When we cut back to William, we see him nervously approaching Amaranthus, who is outside in the garden, and he apologizes to her and insists that he acted that way because he was in shock about Ben and it made him angry with her. And she admits that she had also not been kind to him. So she invites him to sit and tells him more about her marriage to Ben and admits that they were married quite quickly. They had sent a letter, but it seems to have been lost, and that would be why nobody in his family knew about it. When she starts to tend to Trevor, William feels struck by how much he resembles Benjamin, and Amaranthus says it's a reminder of the love that bore Trevor. And William then decides that he is going to do everything he can for Trevor and Amaranthus because his cousins were like his siblings. He grew up with them. And she reaffirms that by saying that Ben had said the same about William to her. This is kind of the first hint into William's hero's journey of the season, so I'll be very curious how much they include of it, and also the Lord John storyline, how they're going to change that and speed it up, because it does last nearly the whole book. When we're back in the woods, we're with Jamie and Bree, who are out hunting, and they are talking about Rob Cameron, and they wonder if Rob has the ability to time travel, and if he does, whether or not he has already traveled back in time to come looking for her or not. Bree figured she and her family would be safer back in time than staying at Lallybroch, and Jamie and her talk about how they can hide the gold in a different location so that if he ever comes back, he would not be able to find that gold through anyone except Jamie, and that removes Jemmy from the equation. In the book, Roger spends a very long time explaining everything that happened in the future to Jamie. It's not Bree, and he includes the whole story with Rob Cameron and Jemmy being kidnapped because he met Jamie's father. And the reason he tells Jamie is because Jamie's sister Jenny is on the ridge in the book, and he's going to see her again, and he worries that Jenny will recognize him from when she was younger and when Roger and Buck visited their home in the past. So again, that's a different storyline that they've shifted around in the show. Jenny isn't in the Americas in the show. I'm curious if they're going to send her there at some point, especially when young Ian has his baby, because she is actually quite important later on in the book. As they are getting back onto the path, Bree and Jamie stumble upon two men who are hanging in the tree labeled with GR, and this is when Jamie kind of points out to Bree that it's not much safer back then. These men were killed for being loyalist, and Jamie has a great line that there are devils on both sides of this war. We see someone then approaching the big house, and it is Captain Cunningham's mother, Elspeth. She's dressed in all black, which we'll learn about later in the season. And Mandy starts singing and showing her her doll. And the two of them get into a tiff because Mandy is so forward. And the woman slaps Mandy across the face. And that's when Jamie and Claire approach her and they introduce themselves. And she presents them with the Jesuit bark. So that's how Claire and Jamie both realize that this must be Mrs. Cunningham. And the scene plays out nearly exactly the same as it does in the book version. So now we've met Cunningham, we've met his mother, we can tell that there's something going on with them, and that's a big storyline that they are going to explore in this season. We've seen that from little splices of the promotional material as well. Later that night, Jamie is sitting by the fire and he opens Soul of a Rebel. The dedication page on the front says, "For my dearest Deadeye," which is what Frank called Bree. So again, we know that he wrote this book and dedicated it to her with a nickname that only she would recognize. And we see Jamie flip to the back of the book, and in the jacket sleeve he sees the photo of Frank, and there is a voiceover that says, "Is it my face you see looming in the darkness?" And it's Black Jack Randall's voice, which is so ominous. I was not expecting that at all. And Claire approaches Jamie and puts her hand on his shoulder, and that snaps him out of it and back into the present. And that's when Jamie asks Claire why she didn't tell him that Frank looked just like Black Jack Randall. And Claire looks very surprised. In the book, this conversation doesn't take place until chapter 72 of Go and Tell the Bees That I Am Gone. And Claire says she hasn't thought about it in a very long time. But once she was acquainted with Black Jack, the resemblance she picked up on when she first met him quickly wore off because he was such an evil person. And Jamie still thinks that she could have told him, but Claire explains that she doesn't know how she would have explained to him. In the book, Jamie tells Claire that he had a dream where he was looking into Frank's face, which then morphed into Black Jack's, and he was staring across Frank's desk at Jamie with his evil eyes, and he had only woken up when he realized how much Frank and Black Jack looked alike, which is why we get that audio overlay in the show. It's meant to convey that internal moment, and we couldn't actually see him dreaming it, so this is kind of the compromise. Jamie says he may have been initially upset about knowing that Frank looked just like Black Jack before, but there would have been no point in him staying upset because he knows that Claire is his. And he starts to ask more questions about Frank, like if he was honest. And Claire admits that they both kept their secrets, but he wouldn't have written anything that he knew to be false. Jamie then tells her that he's already mentioned his name 14 times so far. And Claire can't believe that Jamie is in this book. This dialogue takes place between Jamie and Ian in the book version in chapter 62. So again, the show is very quickly speeding up the timeline and implying that Jamie has already read a lot of the book. So evidently he disappeared that night and read half of the book alone. An important part of this conversation that we don't get here, but I do hope they cover, is that Jamie can tell Frank did not value Claire as much as he does. And Claire tells Jamie that when he was afraid for Claire and the baby's safety, he sent them away. And then contrast that with Frank, who wrote this book while Claire was with him in the future, and he knew that Jamie lived and didn't tell her. So it's a huge admission of Claire and Frank's relationship that he wrote it while she was grieving Jamie, and he chose to keep this from her. And he never wrote the book with the idea or really kind of understanding that the circumstances would work out in this way, where Bree would physically bring this book back through time for Jamie to read, and that he might use the book as a warning. So even though Jamie does largely feel like Frank is speaking to him throughout the story, I don't think that Frank would write this book with that in mind or that intention. So I am hopeful that we'll get that dialogue, and I know for a fact that in this story, Jamie is going to read this book and feel as though Frank is communicating. That's still going to be a big aspect of the show, but Claire doesn't believe that Frank wrote it on Jamie's behalf or as an aid to Jamie. Jamie does then say that the book warns of war in the backcountry and a battle at King's Mountain where a James Fraser dies in it. And that is the cliffhanger for the episode, but it's also a huge window into Jamie's character arc and what he will be going through this season. So that is how we end the episode. They've laid out all the major plot points. We've seen all the major characters. We've gotten kind of a lay of the land of where everyone is at so far. We've reintroduced Fergus and Marcelly. So they cover a lot of ground in this episode, but it felt incredibly fast-paced and very choppy in the edit. So that was something I wasn't entirely thrilled about, but most of the time, the first episode of a season really kind of has to set up things for the rest of the season. So a lot of times it doesn't flow quite as well as later episodes. It has to cover a lot of ground and kind of state things instead of show them to you. So I do feel like it's done a lot of that, and hopefully by next week we'll kind of live in these scenes a little longer, because it felt like we were bumping around from person to person quite quickly, and we never had a scene where we actually stayed in it for long enough to feel like we were enmeshing with the story or feeling like a part of the story. We were more just kind of observing and listening to dialogue and picking up what we're meant to, but we don't actually feel tied to it. At least that's how I felt. I can't believe we're in the final season of Outlander. It's just crazy to me that it's all ending here. So far, they have included a lot from the source material. They've referenced it quite a bit, but the faith stuff is such a departure. I have absolutely no idea where they're planning on taking that. I'm very curious. And the season preview at the end of the episode really does insert a lot of clips that we can kind of infer what they're going to cover. Yeah, let me know your thoughts about episode 1. What was your favorite part? Yeah, what are you most looking forward to as we continue the rest of the season and we finish with the whole 10 episodes and cap this show off, which is just crazy to me. Happy to be back in the Outlander verse. Happy to be back talking about these characters in this story, and excited to see what happens next week. So thank you again for listening. If you've made it this far, I so appreciate it, and we'll chat soon.